Thanks for coming today. Thank all of the individuals that are on by our webcast for our business hour with former Congressman Steve LaTourette and Chris Barron of our McDonald-Hopkins Government Strategies Group. Today we're going to have a conversation with Chris and Steve, talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington in light of the midterm elections. I guess we're all seeing from the very daily news sources that there's a lot of activity going on in Washington, a lot of politics as usual. And hopefully today we'll get a little guidance from Steve and Chris as to what they anticipate will be occurring in the next, to the election sometime in November. So I know there's questions that all of you may have. There'll be cards that you can fill out. Those that are viewing this by a webcast, there's the ability to send your questions and try to answer all of them. To the extent we don't answer all of them, I know that Steve and Chris will follow up as well. So with that, again, hopefully you'll enjoy this conversation. Steve, Chris?
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you for joining us today for this business hour, a conversation with former Congressman Steve LaTourette on policy and politics in a midterm election year. My name's Chris Barron. I'm a strategic communications consultant at McDonald-Hopkins Government Strategies in D.C. Before we get started with our conversation, I have a few guidelines about our format today. We'll be happy to answer any questions from the audience during the program. For those of you here in the Cleveland audience, you can simply write your question down on one of the cards you were given, hold it up, and someone from our McDonald-Hopkins staff will deliver it to us. For our participants outside of Cleveland who are watching this on our live webcast, you're welcome to email your questions by clicking on the email link on your screen. If submitted questions in advance of the program today, we'll try to cover those questions during our discussion today as well. With no further ado, we'll jump right into things. Congressman LaTourette, just yesterday, Dave Camp, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, released his long-anticipated comprehensive tax reform legislation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's in it and what prospects, if any, are there for passing this in 2014?
Sure. A couple of things. You know, comprehensive tax reform is going to have to happen because you need the revenue to pay for some of the other stuff that's going on in Washington. So it's not a Republican or a Democratic position. It was actually moving forward better when Senator Baucus was the Democrat from Montana, was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He now is in Beijing as our ambassador to China. And Ron Wyden, Senator of Oregon, is taking his place. So that's going to put a monkey wrench in it a little bit. But as Chris mentioned, Dave Camp of Michigan, who is in his last year as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, has been working on this forever, and he unveiled his proposal. Now, that's the good news and bad news, but almost immediately after he unveiled his proposal, Mitch McConnell came out and said that it's dead for 2014, and then Speaker Boehner followed suit. As a matter of fact, you know, one of the most closely watched Senate races that we're going to talk about later in the country is down in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell is being opposed by a Tea Party candidate, and a woman named Allison Grimes is the Democrat who will oppose the winner in November. And I thought she had one of the best political lines, even though I'm not a Grimes fan, but best political lines I've heard this year. She said if Mitch McConnell went to the doctor and he was told he had a kidney stone, he wouldn't pass it. Oh, I don't know.
You're just mad you didn't think of that, aren't
you? I love it. but anyway, the tax proposal has things that you know, people are going to like and things that people are not going to like. And so if the good news part of it is that you now have a template out there in the public, and we're going to have a year to sort of pick it apart and find the things that are attractive and try to change the things that are not attractive. And so it creates, you know, good opportunities to engage with your associations or whoever and say, well, yeah, I love this tax reform bill, but I would caution you that Chairman Camp's idea was to start with a blank slate, because one of the reasons we have the tax code we have today is that, you know, it started out as one sheet of paper, it was 1%, and you move along. Well, you got the yes but group, so, well, yeah, we want a flat rate, but you got to preserve the charitable deduction, or yes, we need a flat rate, but you got to maintain the home interest mortgage deduction, and so on and so on. And pretty soon you're at 50,000 pages of tax code with all the yes buts. But just want to go over the highlights of it, and my impression is getting to a flat rate is a good thing. It's projected to raise $700 billion in revenue over the 10-year period that can then be allocated to the budget process. But there's some things that I think some of you in the room are not going to be so crazy about. And so on the social justice side, for people of modest means in our society, it creates a 10% rate for joint filers up to 71,000 something, which obviously is a reduction in what many of those people are paying today and give them more disposable income to raise their families. It would then create a 25% rate for between 71,000 and 450,000 joint filers, and then the 35% rate, which is still a reduction of the top rate today, for those couples making above $450,000. There'll be a standard $22,000 deduction. It repeals the alternative minimum tax, and corporate marginal rates will also go down to 25%, and they'll be phased in and become finally effective under this proposal in 2019 at 25%. Capital gains will be treated as regular income, marginal income. The marginal rates will apply, but the first 40% will be excluded. Child tax credit is plussed up. The mortgage interest deduction that I was talking about, limit of $1 million is going to be cut in half to $500,000. It repeals the deduction of a family's out-of-pocket medical expenses, accelerates depreciation, repeals the medical device tax, which a lot of people are having difficulty with it in the medical space, and it repeals the inflation adjustment for renewable energy production. For those of you in the service industry, I would say that it's not good news in that it directs that with very few exceptions, everyone be placed on, anyone that's on a cash basis accounting system be moved to the accrual accounting system. So I know just here at McDonald Hopkins, I've heard from the partners that this would not be a good thing to pay taxes on things that have been billed and may never be received. So when I say that it's a mixed bag, it has something for everybody, and it also has something for everybody to not like. But there's a reason we haven't had comprehensive tax reform since 1986, because if it was easy, I guess we would have done it before. But so again, for those of you who love it, don't get too excited or plan a vacation based upon the bill passing and being signed by the president. And those of you that hate it, don't panic, because I think that we now have a year to sort of sort it out. We have a midterm election that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but I do think you need to pay attention to this, because this is the first serious template that's been released in a very long time. Now, let me just move forward. So, if this is not going to happen this year, what is going to happen? There are 55 tax extenders that expired or will be expiring as of the first of the year. And part of the Republican strategy was they weren't going to deal with anything. They weren't going to do individual tax bills or anything else until they got this proposal done. Well, now the proposal's done. What you'll see in the next few weeks is sort of a pivot off of this and say, well, we want this to be the template that we're going to move forward with. But now we have to deal with these 55 extenders. So based upon those of you watching the webcast and those of you in the room that have a favorite, like the production tax credit or the research and development tax credit or a variety of other things, there's going to have to be a decision rather soon about what the extender package looks like. And I would suggest to you that and the good news on that is if you like some of these tax extenders, they'll probably be retroactive to January, so that's good. But your tax extender may not make it unless you make sure that, again, your associations or your organizations are pretty proactive to make sure. I spoke this week to the wind energy people. We're in town in Washington this week, and I went over and spoke to them, And if they don't perk up and pay attention, there's going to be no extension of the production tax credit. So check out the 55 extenders. If you got a horse in the race, you need to make sure you're in the race.
You mentioned this kind of mixed bag, and obviously that's the case when you've got a piece of legislation like comprehensive tax reform. As you pointed out, if it was easy, it had been done before now. There's been some griping from Republicans on and off the Hill already, complaining about the timing of the release of this. A lot of folks afraid that this is essentially creating a political piñata for the Democrats to whack for the next couple of months during the election. What do you think about the political up and down side of this bill? Do you think it is worth the kind of political risk to begin a serious conversation about this issue?
Yes, I mean because and you're right. I mean if you were to pick up a Capitol Hill newspaper today, the vultures are all over it, saying, "Oh, we're going to focus on this," or "We're going to focus on this," and pull the piece apart. But you have to consider this proposal as a package, and every number that I've seen during my career and now with McDonald Hopkins Government Strategies tells me that you have to have revenue as a part of the mix if you're going to have a serious attempt to fix the budget crisis. And because of the deadlock in Washington, new taxes are a non-starter on the Republican side. I don't care what you do, you're not going to get new taxes. And so what you have to do is find a way to get new revenues. And as I mentioned, this $700 billion over 10 years is a decent starting place for the Republicans then to go to the Democrats and say, hey, you know what? Okay, here's what the marker that we're putting on the table. What are we going to do on the entitlement side of an equal or greater amount?
Well, on from tax reform to another issue that I feel like we've talked about over and over again over the last year, which I'm sure everybody in this room has heard a lot about, which is comprehensive immigration reform. Right. It's been one of the hottest, most watched, and most volatile issues on the Hill over the last year. It's been pronounced dead and brought back from the dead multiple times. And my question for you is, what, if anything, can we expect to see on immigration over the next year?
Well, it's dead again.
Is this like Weekend at Bernie's dead, or like really, really dead?
No, it's dead again. And again, this goes to, I mean, there's a lot of reasons things aren't moving smoothly in Washington today, but one of them is the lack of trust that exists between the president and the House Republicans. They don't trust each other. They like each other, but they don't trust each other. And so I thought Speaker Boehner, and I'm biased because he's a friend of mine, but the Speaker really went out on a limb when he took the Republicans down to their retreat and laid out principles for immigration reform. Now, like anything else, did it go as far as some Democrats or Hispanic groups wanted to? No. But recognizing that this is a collaborative democracy where you don't get 100% of what you want, the fact that it really took care of the DREAM Act, that is kids who had been brought to this country by their parents who were not in status, but now the kids have the same fate. It takes care of the agricultural worker issue that's so important to, when I represented Lake County, so important to the nursery growers out in Lake County. It took care of E-Verify, the verification system for employers, so they're not being rounded up by ICE on a regular basis for having people who are out of status. And rather than a pathway to citizenship, it had a pathway to status, that you could, if you did certain things like pay taxes, pay a fine, not commit crimes, get legal status in the United States that could eventually translate into citizenship, but only after you got in line, after all the people that are trying to do it the right way. That's a big step for the Republican Party. But almost immediately after those principles were unveiled, Mitch McConnell, again, the guy that won't pass his kidney stone, came out and said, no, we're not doing that in 2014 in the Senate. And then shortly thereafter, there was a revolt among the very conservative in the House of Representatives, who the bottom line for them was their view is that they can't trust the president, that if we had comprehensive immigration reform, he would do all of the parts that he likes, but he wouldn't do the parts that he doesn't like, such as enhanced border security and things like that. So as a result, dead for 2014. But again, just like Camp's tax bill, I think the Boehner immigration principles will probably be the jumping off point in 2015 after we get the midterms out of the way to begin a discussion. And I want to say something nice about President Obama now. Now, the president had a choice. He could, in his State of the Union address, lambasted the Republicans for not being immigration enough and sort of, attempting to pander to the Hispanic community by saying, oh, well, yeah, if we don't have the pathway to citizenship, it's a non-starter. He didn't do that. And he gave Boehner and the Republicans breathing room to come up with this proposal. And even after it was announced, he did not smack it. He said that this is constructive and we're going to have a conversation. So I think the president, in taking that tact on this issue, is setting up immigration reform in a better way than some of the other issues where, he just goes out and takes a swing. I think this was a very constructive way for the president to deal with this issue.
You mentioned the question of trust, and that brings me to the next issue I want to talk about, which is dysfunction in Congress. Yeah. You've talked at length about it. Lots of folks have talked at length about it. Yeah. But over the last few months, it seems like we may have seen a thawing in the frigid relationships on the Hill. We had the passage of the Murray-Ryan budget deal. We managed to pass the omnibus appropriations bill. We avoided another debt ceiling debacle, and we even passed the farm bill. Is this a new kumbaya moment in Washington? Should we expect that we're going to have a more functional Congress, or is this kind of a mirage?
Well, it's an aberration, if not a mirage, in that if you look at, basically, the Republicans have decided that the last debt ceiling discussion, the government shutdown, didn't go so well in public opinion surveys for the Republicans. They didn't really come out as the the party of choice in that discussion. And so as you go into the midterm elections in November, and if in your business, so we're in February and you shut down until November, that'd be silly. But in Washington, they're basically going to shut down until November and talk about what they want to talk about. And so the Republicans want to talk about the Affordable Care Act. And they want to hang the Affordable Care Act around the neck of any Democrat who's running for office at any level. I mean, even if you're running for dog catcher and you're a Democrat, you have something to do with the Affordable Care Act. And on the Democratic side, the president laid out in the State of the Union address, he wants to talk about income equality, and he wants to, or disparity, and he wants to talk about things like the minimum wage. And so that's all you're going to hear. I mean, you'll hear some other stuff, but that's all you're going to hear. So the decision was made by Speaker Boehner that he did not want to put the party in the position of being the issue to take away from that conversation, because both sides, if you talk to their honest brokers, and you got an honest Republican and an honest Democrat who. Tough to do, but and you said which they think they got the winner. The Democrats think this economic disparity argument is a winner, and they can keep control of the Senate, and some of the ones that are actually have a drinking problem think they can take the House back. on the Republican side, the Republicans think that they can take the Senate and get 51 votes or more in the United States Senate. So. It was a calculation by Boehner that we're not going to distract from that conversation moving forward, and I think that's all the conversation is going to be. Because in particular, if you look at, people are saying, man, we had a clean debt ceiling vote. The Republicans who voted on that measure, 199 of them voted not to raise the debt ceiling, and only 28, including all of the Republican leadership, voted for it. Now, some of these conservative groups are attacking them as rhinos and traitors and so forth and so on. And I hesitate to do this because this is being recorded. I'm going to agree with Senator Cruz for a minute. In that the result was known.
This lightning was going to strike.
In that the result was known before the vote. And so everybody knew that the clean debt ceiling was going to pass. And Boehner's job to not make the Republican Party the issue on another government shutdown was to cobble together enough votes, the bare minimum, to join with all the Democrats except for two, to increase the debt ceiling. That then let all these 199 folks vote no. They're happy, you know, because the best vote in town is when something passes and, you know, the world doesn't end and you got to vote no. Because you get to go home and say, you know, I stood up to Barack Obama, I stood up to, you know, and so, you know, I don't make that point the same way that Senator Cruz made it on Mark Levin's program. I mean, he basically said that in his 13 months in the Senate, he's figured out that the thing that Republican legislators fear the most is telling the truth to their constituents. That, to me, that's not very helpful from a Republican messaging standpoint. But he's right in that a decision was made that we're going to move the country forward, pass the debt ceiling clean. The president will sign it, and then let's go to our corners and have this discussion. Well,
there's this perception out there that essentially everything that the Congress is going to do in this session is done. You know, that we avoided the debt ceiling debacle, we've passed the appropriations bill, we got the budget deal. Kind of all of the cliffs, the fiscal cliff, it's all over now, and so people are going to be focused on the midterms. However, there is another issue that is facing us that I don't think has gotten a whole lot of attention and is going to in the next few months. The Highway Trust Fund is expected to run out of money sometime this summer, late this summer, roughly 200 days from now. President Obama is actually in Minnesota today announcing his 4-year, $300 billion plan for the transportation bill, which of course is not paid for. So we're going to have to deal with this. We're going to be facing the highway cliff soon. What are the fault lines on this bill, and is there any chance that we can get a bill done in this Congress? Do we have a choice?
Well, we don't have a choice, and for those of you that don't follow this issue, and I know there's some in the room who follow it really closely, so the Highway Trust Fund, created by Dwight Eisenhower to build the national highway system, when you buy a gallon of gasoline, you pay 18.3 cents is the federal excise tax on gasoline. It goes into a highway trust fund. It's then distributed back out to the states by formula. Ohio gets about 3.8% of that pot based upon population and number of interstate road miles in the state of Ohio. Because the gas tax has not been adjusted since 1993 in the President Clinton's deficit reduction package of that year, it was raised 4.3 cents. There has been there's not enough income coming in. It raises about $38 billion a year, and that's not enough to fund the nation's highway program. So there are only a few things you can do. You can raise the gas tax, which there's no appetite for raising the gas tax, even though, you know, I don't know about you, but I mean, I get gas at noon and it's, you know, $3.40, and I get gas at 7 and it's $3.70. So I really, you know, I don't know that if an education campaign was conducted that told people that if you pay money for the gas tax, we're going to use it for roads and bridges and not something stupid, I bet most folks would go with it. But the reason that it's declined is that a number of reasons. We have higher fuel efficiency cars. So, you know, my Chrysler Newport that I drove in the 1970s, I got 8 miles a gallon. That pumped a lot of money into the Highway Trust Fund. You know, the Prius that gets 45, not so much. Electric vehicles, there's a whole host of things that you know, we've made policy decisions about, but they don't contribute to the trust fund. The good news, and where there is a glimmer of light on the highway bill, so in Dave Camp's proposal, something that I forgot to mention, part of his proposal would be to permit corporations to repatriate funds that they're holding overseas, and they could expense that over 8 years, and that they'd have to pay some taxes on it. But that would then raise $125 billion that would go in to supplement the trust fund in that manner. The president has rolled out, as you indicate, or will be rolling out shortly, a $302 billion 4-year bill. Most highway bills are 6 years. This is a 4-year bill. And that's good. But he doesn't have a suggestion as to how to pay for it, which is a problem. I mean,
yeah.
and so there has to be a conversation as to how you're going to pay for this infrastructure bill. But the fact that you have the President of the United States and the House Republicans talking about the need to get something done, I think it's positive. It needs to be done because if the money that's generated today is not enough money to keep our roads and bridges in a state of good repair, let alone building an interbelt bridge or doing something new. We can't even fix the roads we got with that $38 billion a year, and so somebody has to do something. I never thought that I'd support devolving it all back to the states, but if the federal government is not going to do an effective job of managing the highway program, well then stop taking 18 cents from the folks who buy gas in Cleveland and give it to ODOT and tell them to build the roads.
So I wanted to make a transition over to politics a little bit. It's 2014, and these midterms represent at least for the Democrats, the ominous 6-year itch.
Yep.
The midterm in a president's second term have been notoriously terrible for the president's party. Before we start talking about specific races, talk to us in general about that phenomenon and what does it mean for Democrats heading into these midterms?
Well, the wind is definitely in the face of the Democratic Party based upon history. And I think we put in your materials every midterm election for a sitting president since FDR. And the conclusion that you reach is inescapable. And that is that for whatever reason, no matter who the president is, no matter how well he was liked at the beginning or the middle or everything else, we're a country that tires of people after 6 years, apparently. And so FDR, certainly Dwight Eisenhower, very definitely Richard Nixon with the Watergate business, Jimmy Carter, and then the only aberration, and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And we're not talking like a couple of seats. I mean, in some instances, this is when control of the bodies have changed, and the other party has gained many, many seats. And so just in recent history, the 2010 elections that some people call the Tea Party election, that was President Obama's first midterm election. He lost control, his party lost control of the House, and there were 88 new Republicans elected. I mean, almost a quarter of the body. And so the only exception, notable exception, was in President Clinton's 6-year itch election. And the fact that he actually picked up a couple seats, I would attribute to the fact that we were busy impeaching him at the time. and that wasn't going so good with the American public. So, but other than that, I mean, clearly and that again, if I could circle back and tie it into what we were talking about before about, is this a kumbaya moment? So clearly, if you take the fact that the Republicans think that the Affordable Care Act is a winner, coupled it with that in recent history, the party who controls the White House in the 6th year of a president's term loses dozens of seats, they don't want to be the issue. But to be determined. I mean, there are, one of the things that's happened, a lot of races now are more localized. It's very difficult to run a national campaign for the House of Representatives. And so a lot of them come down to how good are the candidates that you have in your particular district and what the turnout model does and everything else. But unless something strange happens in the next 5 or 6 months, which is possible.
With this group.
The Democrats have the bigger hill to climb than the Republicans do.
Well, talking about all politics being local, let's start with our conversation about the individual races right here in Cleveland.
Sure.
Congressman Dave Joyce, who is your successor in Congress. Yeah. It's always been, that seat's always been a seat that Democrats have thought they could put in play. Right. Remains to be seen whether that's the case or not, but in the near future, Congressman Joyce is facing a challenge from his right, from a Tea Party state legislator. Talk to us a little bit about that race.
Well, the 14th district, which I'm pretty familiar with, is the last swing district in the state of Ohio. It's an R+2, which basically means that if everybody who shows up to vote votes the way that they're supposed to vote based upon previous voting, the Republicans should win 52 to 48. That's not a very safe seat based upon turnout models and everything else. So Dave, who's in his first reelect, and that's always the most dangerous because even though there's a great addition by being the incumbent, well, you only get there after you've been there, 5 or 6 years, and people know who you are, and then it's very difficult to unseat you. But if members lose, most of them lose after that, in that first year, that first re-elect. So, and he's facing a well-financed attorney here from Cleveland, a guy named Michael Wager, who is waiting in the wings for the result of the Republican primary. And, sadly, from my perspective, there was a state representative by the name of Matt Lynch who decided not to run for re-election, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is my daughter, who's sitting here, but the other is that he thought it was a better gamble to unseat Dave Joyce in a primary than to seek re-election for his own seat. And it really is going to be this classic confrontation between the Tea Party versus the establishment. I have a pretty good idea what's going to happen, but we'll see. But the danger in all of these, sort of this fratricide that goes on in both parties, is it really accelerates the not getting anything done. Because if you spend your whole year looking over your shoulder and saying, oh my God, if I'm not conservative enough as a Republican, I'm going to get challenged from the right. And if you spend the whole year as a Democrat looking over your shoulder saying, if I'm not a good enough Democrat, they're going to come at me from the left, well, there's not a lot of motivation to find that sweet spot in the middle to get things done, because you do so at your electoral peril.
And that brings me to a trio of Senate races I wanted to talk to you about where that fratricide is occurring in the Republican Party today. Right. We've got Kentucky, Mississippi, and Kansas. All three of those sitting Republican senators. None of those members would be considered moderates. These are all fairly, if not very conservative members of the Senate. Yeah. Yet all three of them are facing primary challengers from their right. Yeah. This includes the minority leader, Mitch McConnell. Talk to us a little bit about those three races, and do you think that there's a chance that any of those three sitting members loses their primary?
Of the three, the one that folks are watching the closest is the Mississippi race with Thad Cochran. The most ink is about Mitch McConnell's race because he's the minority leader. But the last numbers that I saw is he has the primary pretty well underhand. But again, the disconnect, for me anyway, with what it is the folks in my party are doing by shooting at each other, is that the Secretary of State, Allison Grimes of Kentucky, the Democrat, will be the nominee they've cleared the primary for. And the question is, do you so weaken Mitch McConnell in the primary by calling him all sorts of names that you then set up and lose the seat to Ms. Grimes in November? And for the life of me, I can't figure out, I'm a Republican, and I can't figure out how that furthers the Republican cause to set the minority leader up for failure. I mean, if their fire was directed at electing more Republicans, I guess I could understand that. But, and I have argued and continue to argue that but for this sort of strange mentality, the Republicans would already control the United States Senate. And you just have to go back to the last set of elections. The only person in Missouri that Claire McCaskill could have beaten was Todd Akin, the legitimate rape guy. And there's a reason, if you go to the FEC and dig out her spending reports, she spent $2 million in the Republican primary talking about how Todd Akin was the true conservative in the race. Now, she didn't do that because she thought that was a good idea, that Todd Akin was such a conservative. She wanted him to come out of the Republican primary. You look at Delaware a few years ago. So, Mike Castle, former governor of Delaware, runs against a woman whose first television commercial is "I'm not a witch," Christine McDonald, and how that strategy is somehow seen as furthering the Republican cause. If you're interested in the Republican cause, which I am, I don't get. But anyway, of the three, it's Thad Cochran, and quite frankly, Thad Cochran is a little long in the tooth, and I would equate it to the Dick Lugar. I mean, now here, Dick Lugar, probably one of the most respected experts in recent American history on foreign policy. He made the mistake of not living in Indiana, and which is, I really advise people, if you're going to run for office, you probably should live where you live. And as a matter of fact, he went to visit Gary, Indiana during the election, and he's making the tour, trying to show everybody that he's out and about and around. And the headline, he thought, I'm going to get a great headline that I visited Gary, Indiana. and the headline was that Lugar visits Gary for the first time in 30 years. So it did, sometimes that stuff doesn't work out very well. But so what you had then in Indiana was that a guy named Richard Murdoch, who, like Todd Aiken, decided that we needed to give women advice on rape, got blown out. And you now have Joe Donnelly, who's a really nice guy, but Joe Donnelly they picked up that seat. And so, again, Thad Cochran is probably the one that we need to watch. For
all of the dysfunction, there was a development last night for Republicans, which was surprisingly pragmatic for the GOP.
Yeah.
Ken Buck, the former Senate nominee in Colorado, who lost and was a Tea Party supported candidate, was running again this year. Representative Cory Gardner, who was a freshman member in the House, somebody who clearly has the profile that fits more statewide in Colorado, announced that he was running for Senate. It was immediately picked up as this is a huge recruiting coup for the Republican Party, and Ken Buck, surprisingly, announces that he's not going to run against him in the primary, essentially clearing the field for him. Do you think that the entrance of Cory Gardner in that race really pushes the meter over on the likelihood that Republicans gain control of the Senate?
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far. What I would say is that Cory Gardner would not have decided to leave a safe House seat and run for Senate if he didn't think that that's where it's going. And he certainly puts the Colorado Senate seat in play, and he's a good candidate. He's a nice guy. He's not crazy. And, in that vein, there's a local connection, too. I would go up to Alaska. Those of you that may be familiar with Tremco and the Sullivan family, Dan Sullivan, the mayor of Anchorage, is in a three-way Republican primary to take on Senator Begich up in Alaska. I will tell you, not just because I know the family and I know him, he's normal, and he would be a good guy. Now, but one of the people in that primary is the individual who ran against
Lisa
Murkowski. And so he would be more in the Ken Buck, Christine O'Donnell mold. But that'll be a good sign too. If Dan Sullivan wins that primary, things, in my opinion, will be moving in the right direction.
Well, that's the good news for the Republicans. I want to talk to you particularly about some potential missed opportunities for the party. These could be missed opportunities. Georgia. It's really hard to imagine Georgia electing a Democratic senator. That having been said, there's a wide open Republican primary, and one of the candidates in the primary who's attracted a ton of attention is a congressman named Paul Brown, who's kind of a walking quote machine, and not for any good reasons. And a lot of folks have said if he's the nominee, Democrats have cleared the field for Sam Nunn's daughter to be the nominee. If he's the nominee, you could actually see the Democrats pick up that Georgia seat. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, that's right. Saxby Chambliss, senator, is retiring. He was a classmate of mine in 1994 and then was elected to the Senate. And I think it's a 7-way primary down there. You have 3 sitting House members, Paul Brown, Phil Gingrey, and Jack Kingston, competing with a host of other people. And you're exactly right. So in a 7-way primary, somebody with 29% could win, and there will be a runoff, by the way, too. But you could get into the runoff with like 29% of the vote, and that creates a danger because sometimes in those 7-way primaries that require a low vote total, the people with the energized voting base have the opportunity to sort of bubble up and win without gaining a plurality or majority. My opinion is that if Paul Brown should be the nominee, Sam Nunn's daughter is probably the next senator from Georgia.
Well, I also want to talk about a couple of potential sleeper races. And we see this in those kind of wave election years, like these 6-year itch races. 2 in particular I wanted to ask you about. One in Michigan. Again, Michigan's reliably Democratic seat. Hard to imagine a Republican winning. Yet all the opinion polls show that Terry Lynn Ladd, the Republican, is even or ahead at this point. And in New Hampshire, Scott Brown, who was the senator from Massachusetts, has moved to his vacation home in New Hampshire and is talking about running for Senate. And opinion polls show that he is competitive against Jeanne Shaheen, who's a very popular former governor and current senator. Do you think on election night in November we're going to see some of those races where, because of the wind at the backs of Republicans, we could see one of these folks win in a state that you wouldn't expect normally?
Yeah, I'm not smart enough to tell you the answer to that, but what I am smart enough to tell you is that that's the strategy. That if Republicans behave themselves, which is really a daunting task, over the next 9 months, that they can catch lightning in a bottle, that they'll maintain the gains that they currently have, but they can catch lightning in a bottle up in Michigan, where Carl Levin is retiring and it's an open seat for the first time in a long time. And you get some races that you maybe didn't look so good last year, but all of a sudden become in play. So there's a lot of that, and some of those things, like we talked about the Georgia race. Now, the Georgia race could go the other way, and there are a couple like that based upon how people act in the next 9 months.
Well, and I wanted to turn attention to the House real quick, and we always see retirements,
Right.
but this year in particular, it seemed like we have seen a number of retirements from a lot of swing districts, not just on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side as well. A lot of legislators deciding, hey, you want to know what, I've had enough of this. What do these retirements in these competitive districts, are there a couple of races that you're looking at in particular where you think those could be kind of the bellwethers of whether this is a really great year for Republicans or whether Democrats weather the storm?
Yeah. First of all, I would just opine that the retirements that we're seeing are not good for the country and for the Congress. And I don't care if it's Henry Waxman of California or George Miller of California or John Dingell of Michigan or Frank Wolf of Virginia on the Republican side, or the passing of Bill Young down in Florida on the Republican side. You are literally losing centuries of experience. And I take the view that you're a better member of Congress when you've been there a little while and you know where the bathrooms are and you know actually how to get things done. And the first three names I mentioned, I opposed for 18 years on a variety of issues, but you know what? They were legislators and they knew at the end of the day how to put together legislation to move the country forward and work things out. So the country's not in a better place as a result of these retirements. And I think the last thing that I saw as a result of the wave elections that we've had in 06, 08, and 10, I think it's 42% of the House has served 2 years or less. I mean, that's a remarkable figure. I mean, go back to your offices and look around, and if you had 42% of the people that worked for you had been there 2 years or less, how do you think that would go? But yes, and again, in swing districts, and just a couple, John Runyon, the former University of Michigan Philadelphia Eagle lineman, is retiring because he can't take it anymore from New Jersey. He's just really a nice guy, and he can't take it anymore. The Democrats are licking their chops in New Jersey and think that they have a shot to take that seat. Frank Wolf in Northern Virginia, if you want to talk about bellwether districts. So Frank Wolf has been there 36 years. He is an expert. He used to team with those of you that may have known Tony Hall from Ohio. He has been all over the world fighting for human rights, attempting to alleviate hunger, just a really decent individual. But he has a huge percentage of federal government employees that live in his district, and it is a Democratic seat. And so because Virginia, like Ohio, has become such a swing state, the view is that will be a seat that both sides are going to be watching very, very closely. There's going to be an election here on March the 11th. I mentioned Bill Young passed away. Again, the longest serving Republican. He was chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, former fighter pilot, just another decent man. And on March the 11th, there's a general election between Alex Sink, who is the Democrat, and Dave Jolly, who's the Republican. And that's it's in the West Palm area. And that's a competitive seat. And a lot of the country, because Florida, like Ohio and Virginia, are really, sort of seen as swings. A lot of people are going to be paying attention. And I can guarantee you right now, I mean, no matter who wins, they're going to issue a press release. One side's going to, the winning side is going to say, oh, this
The
shows,
canary in the coal mine.
this is going to show that the wind is at our back, and now we're going to sweep all offices. And the candidate that loses, the side that loses is going to say, oh, this doesn't mean much. It was a localized election. So no matter.
Those press releases are already written.
Yeah, don't read the paper. It's not going to help you.
I want to turn real briefly to a couple questions from the audience.
Yeah.
The first one being a political one. Any thought on the Ohio governor's race?
Well, I think that it's Governor Kasich's to lose. I mean, he had a kind of a rocky start with Senate Bill 5. I think he has found his footing again, and so he's one of the Republican governors that supported Medicaid expansion, which is one of the centerpieces of the Affordable Care Act, and he's done some other things that have infuriated Republicans, and he continues to infuriate Democrats on a regular basis as well. But if you look at his numbers and how things are tracking, and the fact that we're in this year that's probably going to favor, it's going to be a low turnout election that's going to favor Republicans, I think he's okay. Mr. Fitzgerald, I think has a big hill to climb, and that nobody knows who he is outside of Cuyahoga County, by and large. And there's also a feeling in Southern Ohio that the folks in Southern Ohio don't like us here in Cuyahoga County very much. And I remember my first week in Congress, and there was a legislator from Cincinnati, and he said, if it was up to me, we'd take a chainsaw and we'd cut Cuyahoga County out and shove it out into Lake Erie, and you could be your own state. And so I think Mr. Fitzgerald has those obstacles to deal with.
Another question from the audience here, and I think this is a particularly good one for you, is what will it take for Republicans and Tea Party politicians to find common ground?
Yeah.
If Republicans get the majority in the Senate next election, is there any chance of reversing Obamacare?
Well, no. I mean, no. I mean, and that's why, I mean, there may be people here today that are fans of Senator Cruz, and so I'll say this delicately, that's why his filibuster and his strategy to shut down the government was a fool's errand. Because there is no way that the President of the United States down at the White House is all of a sudden slap his forehead and abandon his signature piece of legislation. And so, the goal of doing something is predicated upon, the fact that you work within the constitutional democracy to find the thing that works. And that attitude has cost the Republicans the opportunity to get some things. You're not going to get repeal as long as the president's the president. But the medical device tax that I talked about earlier, that's a part of Dave Camp's proposal, the president was willing to put that on the table. Well, why don't you find the things that you can do? Change CPI, which the president has now abandoned for Social Security calculations. He was willing to put that on the table. If you're interested in entitlement reform, why don't you grab the pieces that are gettable? That doesn't mean you don't try. It doesn't mean you don't make a lot of fancy speeches. But governing is governing. So no, the Affordable Care Act will not be repealed. And I would also say that it's not really the Tea Party. It's these groups who send things to your mailboxes that say, if you send me $100, I'm going to repeal Obamacare, and we're going to make sure to hold these people's feet to the fire. And just to single one out, because I'm debating their president next Wednesday in Washington, D.C., the Club for Growth. Now, the Club for Growth, if you look at 2006, when the Republicans lost control of the House, the organization that I belong to, and me personally, we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Congressional Republican Organization to try and hold on. And that was the President Bush's 6-year itch election. If you look at the Club for Growth, that is raising millions of dollars from people because they're standing on principle, they spent 3 times as much money attacking Republicans in 2006 than they spent attacking Democrats. Well, you could argue, I would argue, that they're not solely responsible, but if Nancy Pelosi doesn't become the speaker in 2007, you don't have Obamacare. You don't have to have this dust up over repealing Obamacare. You don't have to talk about the carbon tax that she got through the House but didn't get through the Senate. You don't have to talk about the $860 billion stimulus package that is still the subject of discussion 5 years later. So again, until the family stops fighting with each other, it's not going to have a happy ending.
Well, and just to follow up on that, I mean, Arlen Specter provided the 60th vote for the Affordable Care Act in the Senate, and Arlen Specter became a Democrat in large part because of the constant attacks on his right flank from the Club for Growth. And I wanted to ask you real quick, we've moved on though from this period where we're attacking the Arlen Specters of the world. I mean, Arlen Specter was a traditional centrist Republican. But now we've seen, whether it's in Idaho's House race or whether it's with Mitch McConnell or Thad Cochran or Pat Roberts, these aren't even guys who fit under the umbrella of general centrists.
Right.
These guys seem to be guys whose only crime is that they're actually participating in the governing process. Is that the new standard for which they're going to be singled out and attacked, is if you're participating in the process?
Yes. If you're seen as complicit in reaching common ground with the Democrats or with the president, you are suspect in the minds of these groups.
That's not encouraging. Something else that's not going to be encouraging. We've got a couple of questions here about deficit reduction.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the president had offered chain CPI before, something that he pulled off the table.
Yeah.
Where are we on a grand bargain? Where are we on deficit reduction? Is it just...
It's dead. Dead. And one of the things that is participating in sort of tamping it down is because people in this room, people outside this room, the American economy is actually, in spite of the nuttiness that's going on in Washington, is actually sort of pulling itself up and figuring out a way to return to profitability and thereby paying taxes and so forth and so on. The deficit's shrinking. And so, what a member of Congress likes better than anything else, to sort of quote Ted Cruz, is not have to vote on something that might piss somebody off. And so, the people now are saying, oh, well, the crisis is over, and we don't have to deal with it. Well, the crisis isn't over. I mean, and anybody that thinks that you can have 10,000 Americans retire each and every day and access Medicare and Social Security based upon the system that was put into place in the 1930s and the 1960s, it's crazy. But that, if this was a tea kettle, they've just opened the top of the tea kettle and let all the steam out, because that's not going to happen. And the president, again, I give the president credit, because the chain CPI isn't that big a deal in the scheme of the federal deficit. It's like $30 billion a year, but it's a deal in that it was a signal that he was willing to talk about entitlement reform. When he went down to the Democratic retreat, I talked about the Republican retreat, they took his hide off, and said, you're messing with our messaging. I mean, we want to go out and say, Republicans want to throw your grandmother over a cliff without medical coverage, and we want seniors on the street begging for pennies, and that's the Republican, that's the Republicans. And if you put chain CPI on the table, we can't make that argument, because then our party is complicit in recognizing that we have to have entitlement reform. And so he pulled it. I mean, I think, to me, more than anything else, that means we're not having a serious discussion on deficit and debt.
Well, I want to try to end on a positive note after.
Well, that'd be great.
I know. I'm going to try. I'm going to ask a question that's going to hopefully elicit a positive response here.
All right.
All right. Obviously, things are a little bleak through the midterms.
Yeah.
But the fact is that once the midterms are over, President Obama is going to have 2 years left. And whatever the Congress looks like, there's going to be an opportunity in that time where you've got a president who's focusing more on his legacy, or most presidents are at that time focused on their legacy. Is there going to be an opportunity, a window, 2015, early 2015, or maybe all of 2015, where we could actually see some of these bigger, more intractable issues actually handled by DC?
You told me I have to be upbeat, right?
Just try your best.
All right, well, here's the deal. I served during two of these, when the president was of one party and the Congress was controlled by the other. So President Clinton, in the last 2 years of his term, we controlled the Congress. President George W. Bush, after the 2006 elections, the Democrats controlled the Congress and the president was a Republican. it can go the Clinton way, or it can go the Bush way. And if the president decides that he wants to have an additional legacy to his term, and is willing to talk turkey on some issues, recognizing he's not going to get 100%, and if the congressional Republicans are willing to talk turkey and recognize they're not going to get 100%, you can get a lot done. And a la Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the most effective president I've served under. I say I'm not supposed to say served under, served with, because we did welfare reform. We did the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. We did a lot of stuff that doesn't get signed into law unless the president is a willing dance partner. Or you can go the George W. Bush route, where the Democrats thought that they won because he's the issue, and so they have no interest in working with him. And quite frankly, he had no interest in working with them. And so as a result, if you look at those years, not much happened. So we'll see. I mean, it really is up to the personalities to say, do we want to govern, or is the whole thing going to be about rearranging the deck chairs for 2016 to see what happens with Hillary Clinton versus somebody? So.
Well, that was kind of upbeat, I guess.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cheerful.
It's great. So we promised to conclude at 1 o'clock, and it's 1 o'clock. If you have additional questions here in Cleveland, we'll be happy to talk to you after the program. For those of you viewing our webcast, you can still email your questions and we'll get back to you. I know there were definitely questions that folks submitted that we didn't have an opportunity to get to. We'll be happy to answer those either today or in the coming days and weeks ahead. We continue to follow the latest developments in DC, and we have several ways that you can join us in this. One, our advisory This Week in Washington is issued every Friday. This advisory also includes a short video conversation with Congressman LaTourette and me. Plus, we will be continuing today's conversation on the Business Advocate, which is our online community at businessadvocate.mcdonaldhopkins.com. The URL is on the front page of your handout. As an attendee of today's event, you should have received a temporary username and password. We'll also be emailing a survey requesting feedback on the business hour today, and we encourage you to respond. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks very much.